What happens when a regime broadcasts a victory to the entire world, stakes its credibility on it, celebrates it in state media for hours, and then the wreckage tells a different story? Because that is exactly what just happened in the skies over the Middle East, and the fallout from it is still being felt in ways most people watching the headlines never even noticed. Before we go any further, if you actually want to understand what's happening in this conflict, instead of just scrolling past another headline, hit subscribe right now. This channel breaks down the real story behind the world's biggest power struggles, and this one is a case study in how modern wars are fought as much with claims and narratives as they are with missiles and jets. Here's how it started. In the middle of an already brutal exchange of strikes between Iran and the United States, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps went public with an extraordinary claim. According to Iranian state media, IRGC aerospace forces had launched a wave of ballistic missiles at a coalition airbase deep in Jordan's eastern desert, a facility used to house some of the most advanced aircraft in the American arsenal. The target, according to Tehran, wasn't just any part of the base. It was the maintenance hangar and deployment ramp where U.S. F-35 stealth fighters were kept. And the claim wasn't modest. Iranian officials said 3 F-35s were completely destroyed. 3 more, they said, were badly damaged. On top of that, they claimed a number of American officers and technical personnel had been killed in the strike. If true, this would have been one of the most significant single losses of advanced air power the United States had suffered in decades. The F-35 isn't just another jet. It's arguably the most expensive and most technologically sensitive aircraft program in human history. A plane built specifically to be invisible to radar and to operate inside airspace no other aircraft could survive in. Losing of them in a single strike, other aircraft could survive in. Losing of them in a single strike be a genuine strategic wound, not 3 with just a symbolic one. Iranian state media didn't just report the claim quietly, they ran with it. The story that Iran had struck a devastating blow against America's most prized weapon system spread across Tehran-aligned outlets within hours, then jumped onto social media, where it picked up enormous traction. Screenshots and translated posts spread across X and Telegram, framing it as a turning point in the war. For a regime that had spent weeks absorbing hit after hit from American and Israeli strikes, this was exactly the story its own population needed here. A win. A real one. Something to hold on to kind. There was just one problem. The United States said none of it happened. Within hours, U.S. Central Command, the military command responsible for operations across the Middle East, posted a direct rebuttal. Their message was blunt and left little room for ambiguity. No American aircraft had been destroyed or damaged in the attempted Iranian strikes, and every missile and drone launched at the base had either been intercepted or had failed to reach its target. CENTCOM went further, listing out a series of Iranian claims made around the same period, from the destroyed F-35s to assertions about naval movements in the Strait of Hormuz, and labeling each one false, one after another. So now you have 2 totally incompatible stories sitting side by side. One side says 3 of America's most advanced fighter jets were turned into wreckage. The other side says nothing happened at all, that every incoming threat was stopped before it ever got close. And here's the part that should make you lean in a little closer. This wasn't the first time. It wasn't even the second or third. Over the course of this conflict, Iran had already claimed on separate occasions to have shot down or seriously damaged F-35s belonging to both the United States and Israel. Iranian outlets had previously reported striking Israeli F-35s over Tabriz. Other claims described a jet downed over central Iran, with Iranian officials suggesting the pilot's survival was unlikely. Each time the claim spread fast through Iranian and pro-Iranian channels. Each time, American or Israeli officials pushed back, either denying it outright or offering a very different account of what had actually happened. If you're starting to sense a pattern here, you're right. And that pattern is exactly what makes this story worth taking seriously. Not because of what it tells us about a single missile strike, but because of what it reveals about how this entire war is actually being fought, on 2 fronts at once. One front is physical. Missiles, jets, air defense systems, real steel, and real casualties. The other front is informational, a battle over which version of events the world, and more importantly, each side's own population, chooses to believe. Let's slow down for a second and actually walk through what happened, because the details matter here more than the headlines. The strike Iran was referring to targeted Al-AZRAQ Air Base, a facility in Jordan's eastern desert that has served as a hub for coalition aircraft, including American F-35s operating in the region. According to the IRGC's own account, the attack was framed as retaliation. Just prior to it, the United States had reportedly carried out a strike on residential structures on Iran's Qeshm Island, an attack Iranian authorities said had killed civilians. In the IRGC's telling, The missile barrage on Al-AZRAQ was payback, a proportional response that struck a devastating blow against the very jets that had been used against Iranian targets throughout the war. On paper, that's a clean, satisfying narrative. Iran gets hit, Iran hits back. Iran wins the exchange. It's the kind of story that plays extremely well domestically, especially for a government that badly needs its population to believe it still has the capability to strike back against a vastly more powerful adversary. But here's where things get complicated, and where you start to see just how much modern warfare depends on controlling the story as much as controlling the battlefield. Jordan's own armed forces, a country that has no particular incentive to make Iran look weak, and every incentive to appear competent in defending its own territory, released their account of the same incident. According to Jordanian officials, their air defense systems detected the incoming missiles, tracked them, and intercepted several of them before they could reach anything resembling a hangar full of stealth fighters. Jordanian authorities reported 0 casualties and did not confirm the loss of any aircraft whatsoever. So think about what you actually have here. 3 separate parties. Iran claiming a major victory, the United States categorically denying any losses, and Jordan, the country whose own soil the strike allegedly took place on, reporting an intercepted attack with no casualties and no confirmed aircraft losses. 2 out of 3 parties are telling a story that directly contradicts Iran's version, and the third party, Jordan, isn't really backing Iran's claim either. That's not a minor discrepancy. That's a near total collapse of Iran's public narrative the moment anyone outside Tehran's media ecosystem looked closely at it. If you're finding this as fascinating as I do, make sure you're subscribed, because the next part of this story is where things get genuinely strange, and where a completely separate incident ends up explaining almost everything about why claims like this keep happening in the first place. Because this isn't actually the first time an Iranian claim about a downed F-35 has run into a very inconvenient collision with physical evidence. Weeks before the Al-AZRAQ claims, a different incident unfolded that gives you a rare, almost perfect window into how these narratives get built and how they sometimes fall apart. Iranian state media reported that their air defense forces had shot down a U.S. fighter jet over a mountainous province in central Iran. Almost immediately, the story that spread through Iranian outlets identified the aircraft as an F-35 Lightning II, the same stealth fighter at the center of the Al-AZRAQ claims. It was a dramatic story, an American stealth jet, supposedly one of the hardest aircraft in the world to detect and shoot down, brought out of the sky by Iranian air defenses. Reports at the highest levels of the U.S. government took notice. According to reporting at the time, the sitting American president was personally briefed on the incident, and then the wreckage photos came out. Iranian media released images of the crash site, presumably to back up their claim and show proof of the kill. But when analysts, aviation experts, and open-source investigators actually looked closely at the wreckage, the story fell apart almost instantly. The debris didn't match an F-35 at all, based on the shape of the components, the design of the airframe, fragments, and specific structural details visible in the photos. Independent analysts concluded the aircraft was almost certainly an F-15E Strike Eagle, a very different, older, and far less strategically sensitive aircraft, likely from a squadron based out of the United Kingdom. Read that again. Iran claimed to shoot down the most advanced stealth fighter in the American arsenal. The evidence they themselves released to prove it showed a completely different aircraft, one that isn't even in the same category of technological sensitivity. An F-15E getting shot down is a real event, a real loss, a real story. But it is not remotely the same story as an F-35 falling out of the sky. One suggests Iran has developed a genuine capability to threaten America's most sophisticated stealth technology. The other suggests Iran shot down a 4th-generation jet using conventional air defense systems, something that, while still significant, doesn't carry anywhere near the same strategic weight. So why would Iran's own media release wreckage photos that seemingly undercut their own claim? There are really only 2 explanations, and both of them tell you something important. Either Iranian officials didn't actually know which aircraft they'd hit and simply assumed, or chose to claim, that it was the most prestigious possible target, or they knew exactly what they'd hit and made a calculated decision that the propaganda value of claiming an F-35 kill was worth the risk of the story eventually being picked apart by outside analysts. Either way, the pattern is the same one you saw with the Al-AZRAQ claims. Announce the biggest possible version of the story first, let it spread as far and as fast as it can. Deal with the scrutiny later, if it even reaches the audience the claim was originally aimed at. And that's really the key to understanding almost everything about how these claims function. They're not primarily designed to convince military analysts in Washington or London. Nobody in the Pentagon changes their assessment of the war based on a state media broadcast. These claims are aimed inward at an Iranian population that has spent months absorbing airstrikes, economic strain, and a war they did not choose and cannot easily escape. A population that needs, desperately, to believe their military can still hurt the other side. Every claimed F-35 kill, whether it's the version at Tabriz, the version over central Iran, or the version at Al-AZRAQ, serves the exact same emotional and political function. It tells ordinary Iranians, your government is still capable. Your air defenses are not obsolete. You are not defenseless. If this kind of honest breakdown of what's actually happening is something you want more of, tap that like button right now. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who are tired of surface-level headlines and want the full picture. Now, let's talk about why the F-35 specifically keeps showing up in these claims, because that's not random either. Of every aircraft the United States operates, the F-35 carries a symbolic weight that almost nothing else in the American arsenal can match. It's the most expensive weapons program in the history of the Pentagon, a jet designed around stealth technology. So advanced that even sophisticated radar systems struggle to detect it reliably. For decades, American military strategy in the region has rested partly on the assumption that F-35s can operate deep inside contested airspace with a level of survivability that older aircraft simply don't have. That reputation is precisely why claiming to destroy one carries so much more propaganda value than claiming to destroy almost anything else in the American inventory. Shooting down an older fighter jet, while still a real military event, doesn't challenge the core assumption underpinning American air superiority in the region. But claiming to destroy an F-35, especially claiming to destroy 3 of them in a single strike, directly attacks the idea that American stealth technology is untouchable. It's not just a battlefield claim, it's an attempt to puncture the single biggest psychological advantage the United States holds in the air war. This is why you'll notice the F-35 specifically, rather than other American aircraft, keeps reappearing across multiple separate incidents throughout this conflict. It's not a coincidence born out of which jets happen to be flying which missions. It's a deliberate targeting of the story, not just the aircraft, even when the underlying facts turn out to involve a completely different plane, as they apparently did with the F-15E incident. The initial framing almost always reaches for the F-35 first, because that's the version of the story that does the most psychological damage if people believe it, and gets picked up by the most international outlets before anyone has time to check. Let's shift now to the American side of this, because CENTCOM'S response pattern is just as revealing as Iran's claims in a completely different way. Throughout this conflict, U.S. Central Command has developed something close to a standardized rebuttal format. When Iranian state media puts out a claim, CENTCOM doesn't just issue a vague denial. They tend to respond with a structured breakdown, listing each individual Iranian claim and pairing it with a direct factual counter. In the AZRAQ case of the Al-AZRAQ incident, that meant addressing not just the F-35 claim, but a cluster of other claims made around the same time, including assertions about the safety of commercial shipping routes and reports about a tanker allegedly breaking through a naval blockade. Why does that pattern matter? Because it tells you CENTCOM understands exactly what kind of war they're actually fighting alongside the physical one. If Iranian claims went unanswered, even false ones, they would still spread, still get picked up by outlets sympathetic to Tehran's framing, and still shape how people around the world, and crucially, how people inside Iran with access to outside information, understand the state of the conflict. By responding quickly, specifically, and repeatedly, the American approach is designed to prevent any single narrative from setting in before it can be challenged. But here's the uncomfortable complication in all of this, the part that a lot of coverage conveniently leaves out. CENTCOM's denials are not automatically true just because they come from a more institutionally trusted source than Iranian state media. Military communications from every country involved in a conflict carry their own incentives to shape a favorable narrative. American officials have their own history in this conflict and others of initial statements later being revised, clarified, or quietly walked back as more information became available. The honest position here isn't that one side is a pure source of truth and the other is pure propaganda. It's that both sides are running information operations simultaneously with the physical war. And the actual truth of any individual incident often sits somewhere that takes independent verification, like the wreckage photo analysis from the F-15E incident, to actually establish. That distinction matters enormously if you actually want to understand this conflict instead of just picking a side to cheer for. The F-15E wreckage story is valuable precisely because it's one of the rare moments in this entire war where something close to independent verification was possible. Analysts weren't relying on either government's word, they were looking at physical debris and matching it against known aircraft designs. That's about as close to ground truth as this kind of conflict typically allows for, and it strongly suggests at least one major Iranian F-35 claim was either mistaken or deliberately inflated. So does that mean every single Iranian claim throughout this war has been false? Not necessarily, and it would be intellectually dishonest to assume that. There have been incidents throughout this conflict where American officials themselves confirmed real damage to their own aircraft, including at least one case where U.S. officials acknowledged an F-35 had taken hostile fire during a combat mission over Iran and been forced into an emergency landing at a regional base, with the pilot reported in stable condition afterward. That incident is important precisely because it shows this isn't a simple story of Iran lying and America telling the truth. Real damage has happened. Real jets have taken real hits. The pattern that keeps appearing isn't that every claim is false, it's that the scale and details of claims coming out of Tehran consistently run ahead of what independent evidence ends up supporting, whether that's inflating a damaged jet into a destroyed one, or misidentifying which aircraft was actually involved altogether. Let's talk now about why the specific dynamic claim and rebuttal keeps repeating instead of settling into a single agreed-upon version of events like conflicts often did in past decades. Because the honest answer has almost nothing to do with the missiles themselves and everything to do with how information moves in the world right now. In previous generations of conflict, a claim like this would have taken days or weeks to spread beyond the region, filtered through wire services, foreign correspondents, and editorial desks that had time to check sourcing before publishing. By the time most of the world heard about an incident, there was usually already some layer of verification built into the process. That entire system has effectively collapsed for conflicts happening right now. A claim posted by Iranian state media can reach millions of people globally within minutes, translated, screenshotted, and reposted across platforms with zero editorial friction in between. The same is true of CENTCOM'S rebuttals. Both sides are now operating as their own instant global broadcasters, with no meaningful delay between an event, real or claimed, and its arrival in front of a worldwide audience. That collapse in verification time is exactly why stories like this need so much unpacking after the fact. The initial version of events that most people see and remember isn't the version that survives careful scrutiny. It's whichever version got published first and spread fastest, regardless of how accurate it turns out to be. And by the time a fact check or independent analysis comes out, whether that's Jordan's account of intercepted missiles or the wreckage analysis showing an F-15E instead of an F-35, most of the audience that saw the original claim has already moved on, and the corrected version reaches only a fraction of the people who saw the initial dramatic headline. This is, frankly, one of the most underappreciated dynamics of modern warfare. It's not just about who has better missiles or stronger air defenses. It's about who can control the first version of the story that reaches the largest audience, because that first version tends to be the one that sticks in people's minds, even after it's been contradicted or walked back. Now let's talk about what this pattern actually costs Iran strategically, because there's a real risk buried inside this approach that goes beyond just occasionally getting caught exaggerating. Every time a claim like the Al-AZRAQ F-35 story gets made and then gets directly contradicted, whether by CENTCOM'S rebuttal, by Jordan's own account, or by independent open source analysis picking apart wreckage photos, it chips away at the credibility of the next claim. This is a genuinely dangerous position for a government to be in during an active war, because credibility is one of the only tools available when your actual military capabilities are visibly being worn down by sustained conflict. Think about it from the perspective of an ordinary Iranian following the war through state media. The first time you hear a triumphant claim about a downed F-35, it's exciting, reassuring, exactly the kind of news you're desperate for after weeks of your own cities absorbing airstrikes. The second time it happens, and it turns out to involve a different, less significant aircraft, some of that excitement gets replaced by doubt, by the third or fourth version of essentially the same claim, especially if outside evidence keeps contradicting the official story. You start to get a population that's genuinely uncertain what to believe from their own government, which is an extraordinarily corrosive position for any regime to be in, especially one already under this much internal economic and military pressure. And this is where the story connects back to something bigger than any single missile strike or any single jet. This entire pattern, claim big, get contradicted, claim big again, is a symptom of a government that understands its actual battlefield options are narrowing, and that psychological and informational victories have become nearly as valuable as physical ones, because physical victories against a technologically superior adversary have become genuinely difficult to produce. When you can't reliably win the actual air war, you can still try to win the story about the air war, at least for a little while, at least for the audience that matters most to your own political survival. If you've made it this far into the video, you clearly care about understanding what's actually happening here instead of just reacting to a headline. Drop a comment and tell me which part of this surprised you most, whether it's the F-15E mix-up, the CENTCOM rebuttal pattern, or the deeper question of what these claims are really designed to do. I read these, and they genuinely shape what I dig into next. Let's talk now about where this actually leaves things, because the honest answer is messier than either side's version of events would suggest. There are really three possibilities sitting in front of anyone trying to seriously evaluate what happened at Al-AZRAQ, and each one carries different implications for how you should think about the rest of this conflict going forward. The first possibility is that CENTCOM'S account is essentially accurate, that Iranian missiles were intercepted before reaching anything of real value, and that the entire F-35 destruction claim was fabricated from the start for domestic consumption. Given Jordan's own reporting of intercepted missiles and 0 confirmed aircraft losses, and given the precedent set by the F-15E misidentification incident, this is, on the available evidence, the most likely scenario. It fits the broader pattern of Iranian claims consistently outrunning what independent verification ends up supporting. The second possibility is that something real did happen at Al-AZRAQ. Real damage of some kind to the base or its facilities, but the scale and specifics got dramatically inflated in the retelling, similar to how a real F-15E loss appears to have been reported as a far more significant F-35 loss in the earlier incident. Under this scenario, there's likely a kernel of truth buried under layers of exaggeration, the kind of thing that might eventually get clarified through satellite imagery or other independent means, but probably not before the initial dramatic version has already done its work shaping public perception. The third possibility, and the one that would represent the most significant development, if it turned out to be accurate, is that Iran genuinely did strike and destroy advanced American aircraft, and that both the United States and Jordan have strong incentives of their own to downplay a real and serious loss, whether to avoid appearing vulnerable, to protect operational security around what actually happened, or to avoid domestic and international pressure that would come with acknowledging a significant setback. This possibility can't be dismissed purely because it's the least convenient one. Governments on every side of every conflict have historically downplayed real losses when acknowledging them served no strategic purpose. The honest position, the one that actually respects how uncertain real-time conflict reporting isn't to confidently declare any one of these three scenarios as the definitive truth. It's to recognize that right now, based on everything publicly available, the weight of evidence leans heavily toward the first scenario, given Jordan's independent account and the precedent of the earlier misidentified wreckage. But it's also to stay honest about the fact that leans toward is not the same thing as proven beyond doubt, and that in a war being fought this heavily through competing narratives, definitive certainty about any single incident is often the hardest thing of all to actually achieve. Let's step back now and talk about the bigger picture here, because this pattern, claims of destroyed F-35s specifically, is going to keep showing up again and again as this conflict continues, and now you have the tools to actually evaluate it every time it does, instead of just reacting to whichever headline crosses your feed first. Watch for a few specific things. Watch whether independent, non-aligned parties, like Jordan in this case, corroborate or contradict the claim. Watch whether any physical evidence, wreckage photos, satellite imagery gets released, and watch closely whether that evidence actually matches the claimed aircraft type. Because, as the F-15E incident showed, the gap between the claimed target and the actual target can be enormous. And watch how quickly and how specifically the American response comes, because a rapid, detailed rebuttal tends to indicate a higher degree of confidence in the underlying facts, while vague or delayed responses tend to indicate genuine uncertainty even within the U.S. military's own assessment. None of this is about picking a side to root for. It's about recognizing that in a war, being fought as intensely through information as through missiles, your job as someone trying to actually understand what's happening isn't to immediately believe the most dramatic version of any story. It's to wait just slightly for the second and third pieces of information to arrive before deciding what actually happened. Let's go a layer deeper on something most coverage of this incident skipped entirely, the actual mechanics of how a claim like 3 F-35s destroyed gets manufactured in the first place, because understanding the process tells you almost as much as understanding the outcome. A ballistic missile strike on a base like Al-AZRAQ doesn't come with a built-in scorecard. Missiles are launched from Iranian territory, travel for minutes across hundreds of miles, and by the time they arrive, whatever happens next is being assessed almost entirely through secondhand information, radar tracking, satellite passes, and whatever visual confirmation happens to exist. Iran's own forces, launching from deep inside their own territory, typically have no direct visual confirmation of what their missiles actually hit. What they have instead is intent, trajectory data, and crucially, a very strong incentive to report the most favorable possible outcome. This is why claims like this tend to follow a predictable escalation pattern. The first reports out of Tehran are often vague. A strike was carried out, the target was hit. Within hours, state media fills in the details, sometimes based on genuine intelligence, sometimes based on not much more than educated guesswork dressed up as certainty. By the time the story reaches international audiences, it has usually solidified into the most dramatic version available. 3 jets destroyed, officers killed, a decisive blow struck. Even if the actual battle damage assessment, the real one, sitting in a classified folder somewhere, tells a completely different story. Compare that to how the American side typically operates. CENTCOM'S assessments are built on a very different information pipeline, radar tracks showing interceptor missiles engaging incoming threats, physical inspection of the base itself, and direct accountability for every aircraft on that base. Because, unlike Iran, the United States isn't guessing about what happened to its own jets from hundreds of miles away. It has people standing on the tarmac who can walk out and count them. That structural asymmetry, one side inferring outcomes from a distance, the other side physically present to verify them, is a big part of why CENTCOM'S rebuttals tend to be specific and fast, while Iranian claims tend to be dramatic and comparatively light on verifiable detail. None of this means the American position is automatically correct in every case. Militaries have absolutely misrepresented battle, damage before in this conflict and plenty of others throughout history. But it does explain, mechanically, why the pattern keeps tilting the way it does, and why claims made from a distance, under pressure, with enormous political incentive to report success, deserve real scrutiny before anyone treats them as settled fact. There's another angle worth exploring here, and it's one that rarely gets discussed outside of specialist defense circles. What it would actually mean, strategically, if Iran genuinely had developed the capability to reliably threaten F-35s with ballistic missiles fired from its own territory. This matters because the claim itself, regardless of whether it's true in this specific instance, is doing strategic work just by existing. Every adversary and ally watching this conflict, from Gulf states hosting American aircraft to countries considering their own defense purchases, is absorbing a signal about American air power's vulnerability, real or imagined. If Iran can convince even a fraction of the world that F-35s parked on the ground are at genuine risk from missile strikes, that shifts calculations about where those aircraft get based, how heavily those bases need to be defended, and how confident allies feel hosting them at all. That's precisely why a claim doesn't need to be true to be strategically valuable. It only needs to be believed by enough of the right audience for long enough to shape decisions. And that's the uncomfortable reality sitting underneath this entire story. Even a claim that gets thoroughly debunked, like the F-15E incident being initially reported as an F-35 kill, still did its work in the hours and days before the correction caught up with it. The correction rarely travels as far as the original claim. That imbalance is, arguably, the single most exploitable weakness in how modern information moves. And it's one that governments on every side of this conflict clearly understand and are actively using. There's also a real cost on the American side to how this dynamic plays out, one that doesn't get discussed nearly as often as it should. Every time CENTCOM has to issue a rapid, detailed rebuttal to an Iranian claim, it's spending institutional credibility and bandwidth on a defensive information battle rather than purely on military operations. That's not a criticism of the decision to respond. Staying silent would almost certainly be worse, allowing false claims to solidify unchallenged. But it does mean part of the American military's resources in this conflict are being directed at narrative management rather than at the physical battlefield alone, which is itself a sign of how seriously modern militaries now treat the information dimension of war. There's also a worthwhile lesson in the fact that we, as an outside audience thousands of miles from any of this, mostly have to work with, is a version of the story from a handful of interested parties. That's uncomfortable. But it's also just genuinely how war reporting works in real time, especially in a conflict this contested and this fast-moving. The wreckage photo mismatch from the earlier F-15E incident stands precisely because it's a rare exception to that rule, a case where something close to independent physical evidence briefly became available and let outside analysts actually check a claim against reality instead of just weighing two competing statements against each other. There's also a human dimension to this that's worth sitting with for a moment, because it's easy to treat stories like this as pure strategy and forget there are real people connected to every version of these events. If the American account is accurate, then real pilots and maintenance crews at a real base in Jordan spent hours under the threat of incoming ballistic missiles, not knowing in the moment whether their defenses would hold. If any version of Iran's account contains real truth, then the family of the reported F-15E pilot, or any American service member connected to any of these incidents throughout the war, has had to live through the same kind of uncertainty and fear that comes with any modern conflict, regardless of which government's press release turns out to be more accurate. And on the other side, ordinary Iranians consuming state media coverage of these claimed victories are, whether they realize it or not, being handed a version of the war curated specifically to manage their morale rather than to inform them, which carries its own quiet cost, the slow erosion of a population's ability to actually know what's happening in the country they live in. That's really the through line connecting every piece of the story. Wars like this one aren't just being fought over territory or military assets anymore. They're being fought over what each side's own population, and the watching world, actually believes is true. And in that fight, the wreckage of a single misidentified jet in central Iran tells you more about how modern conflict actually works than almost any missile strike could on its own. One last thread worth pulling on before we close this out, because it connects almost everything we've covered into a single uncomfortable observation. Notice how differently each audience actually experiences this story. Someone in Tehran watching state television sees a clean, triumphant narrative. Missiles launched, a hangar full of stealth jets destroyed, a blow struck against the country that has been bombing them for weeks. Someone in Washington, scrolling through a CENTCOM statement, sees an entirely different story. An enemy lying about a failed attack to save face domestically. Someone in Amman, reading their own military's report, sees a third story altogether, missiles intercepted, a crisis managed, no losses to report. 3 completely different emotional experiences of the exact same. 8 or 9 hours in the eastern Jordanian desert, shaped almost entirely by which government's information ecosystem each audience happens to live inside. That's not a flaw in the system. That is the system, working exactly as each side intends it to. And it's worth remembering the next time any claim like this crosses your feed, whether it's about F-35s, naval blockades, missile interceptions, or anything else coming out of this conflict. The question worth asking isn't just, did this happen? It's, who benefits from me believing this happened? And how quickly will I actually get to find out if it's true? In a conflict like this one, that second question often turns out to be the more important one, because the honest answer, more often than not, is that verification arrives slowly, imperfectly, and long after the original claim has already done whatever work it was designed to do. Let's bring this back to where we started. A government claimed it had delivered a major impact against one of the most advanced aircraft in the world. The information available so far, an independent account from the country where the event allegedly took place, a direct and specific response from the country whose aircraft were reportedly affected, and an earlier incident where physical evidence told a very different story than the initial claim, all points in one direction more than the others. But the full picture, the kind of picture that only comes from independent confirmation rather than competing statements, is still forming, the same way it was still forming in the moments after that first debris photo went public before anyone had matched the pieces to the right source. What we do know, with real confidence, is this. The claim was made instantly, spread globally within hours, and was consumed by millions of people who will likely never see the more complicated, more uncertain follow-up. That gap between how fast a dramatic claim travels and how slowly the actual truth catches up to it might end up being the single most important pattern to understand about this entire conflict, more important, in the long run, than the fate of any individual aircraft. Because wars are increasingly being decided not just by who wins the exchange of fire, but by who wins the exchange of stories about that exchange of fire. And right now, in this specific incident, the story that traveled fastest and the story that the available evidence actually supports appear to be 2 very different things. If this video helped you actually understand what's happening in this conflict instead of just watching the headlines fly past you, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe. Share it with someone who's tired of the 30-second version of the story, and I'll see you in the next one, where we go even deeper into the stories actually shaping this war.